So let me go ahead and talk about Jackson. This is taking us from kind of backtracks a little bit. We've talked about Monroe quite a bit, and I've given you some little tidbits about Jackson and a little bit about John Quincy Adams. So this will kind of backtrack to when Jackson really begins to emerge on the scene. A lot of this I've already kind of by way of just kind of filling you in on some of what I call the TMZ moments of Andrew Jackson. Um, this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. I mentioned that he was had as a teenager was involved with the Revolutionary War, was a planter, fought in Florida, fought in the War of 1812, all that kind of stuff, right? Very much kind of a rough colonial frontier character, so he's very different in that sense. He claims that he is the heir to Jeffersonian idealism, that he is the one who is going to continue on that Jeffersonian vision that you guys have been reading about. So this is kind of his claim to fame, if you will. So he believes in kind of the popular vote. He believes in wider male suffrage. He believes in land ownership and expansion. And he does not like the Bank of the United States. Now, his attitude about the Bank of the United States is largely due to the fact that he lost a couple of fortunes thanks to these panics and these boom and bust cycles, right? He was very much your frontier speculator type of person. And he blamed when he would lose money like that, he would blame it on this economic system, on the Bank of the U.S. and that kind of thing, rather than his, just things that happened or his own speculative efforts or whatever. What he thinks is that the whole division within the Democrat Republicans in this era of good feelings, that these are messing up democracy, that they are encouraging corruption. And he sees John Quincy Adams in particular as being a symbol of kind of patronage, somebody who's gotten where he is through favoritism. Of course, he's, for Jackson, who comes from no one, right? He definitely looks at Adams and says, well, it's because of who his father was, right? And blames the bureaucratic system, blames big government. Remember, he's that Jeffersonian that says big government is not to be trusted. So he really kind of buys into that theme. Now, he talks a lot about corruption as far as John Quincy Adams is concerned. Note that he's very willing to use what we call the spoils system. Spoils system is basically, the notion that you have to the victor go the spoils, right? Whoever wins gets to nominate the most people and that kind of thing. So he sees himself and his leadership as being different, even though really most people would argue that he acts very much the same way as everyone else. In fact, probably worse because he was so domineering and that kind of thing. Couple of key ideas. Remember that Jackson creates a very strong, overbearing executive office. And so he is not afraid of using executive power. So this is part of the irony of him suggesting that it is the popular will that matters the most. Because I'm not sure that he really thought, he says he thinks that, but does he really in practice think that? When he's willing to use his executive office however he wants and to do things however he wants. He claims to be an outsider outside of the corruption that we see or he accuses John Quincy Adams of. Says that he will not favor manufacturing, that he will not favor the banking system, and that sort of thing. Says that he talks a lot, or he refers to government reform, but he never quite goes into a lot of detail. So he kind of appeals to the common man idea, the idea that ordinary citizens are somehow going to identify with his frontier experience. They're going to identify with his I'm willing to fight a duel kind of thing, that they're going to identify with his kind of aspiration, coming from nothing, if you will, this kind of aristocracy of merit. Again, understand that this is a guy that has played hard, played rough, probably hasn't always played fair, but he seems to only get really upset when somebody's not being fair against him. So it's kind of interesting that he really kind of talks a lot about the common man, but by the time he's running for president, he is wealthy. He owns a plantation. I think he actually owns a couple. So he says he's the common man, and I guess his background is, but he's not really living that way. And so he tends to support those wealthier people. And party leadership during this period is really going to begin to take on this idea of the elite party machine. We'll be talking about party machine politics really throughout most of the 1800s, and you still see some shades of it here and there. I mean, we talk about the head of the Republican Party or the head of the Democratic Party. But back in the 1800s, the party leadership was much more something that that was controlled by people outside of the candidates. In other words, you would have kind of the guy that the party head, the party boss that dictated how things would be done in different states and different regions. And so party leadership is absolutely kind of this elite group of people that have access to the halls of power, if you will. Most of the time they're well-to-do, and they certainly kind of create this, we would think of it as a lobbyist kind of system these days. And of course the idea here is to get elected and stay elected. And within this system, as we've come out of the Panic of 1819, you begin to see a lot of states drop suffrage requirements for men. Women and blacks, of course, are not included in that. And as we have a more opened up system, a more openly democratic system where you don't have to own property or you only have to own very little, politics is going to start to really appeal to people. And so, you're going to have people that go to saloons and, hey, the party boss or the candidate buys you a beer. Or they have a big barbecue or a big cookout and encourage you to, vote for so-and-so. And, a lot of times we see kind of the same thing. Nowadays we have political ads, right? These political ads appeal to the ordinary people, appeal to their sensibility, make cultural references that ordinary people would understand, and even kind of appeal to senses of class and senses of race and status and that kind of thing. So you can see different ads that appeal to different things. Well, in this period, that appeal, because you don't have the level of mass media that we do, of course, today, that sort of appeal was based on the locality. So if you were in a city like Philadelphia, you would have a very refined way to reach out to people. If you're off in the backwoods of Kentucky, you're talking about having a hootenanny and a barbecue and all that kind of stuff, and probably throwing in a little whiskey along with that. So there's a lot of ways to kind of facilitate, if you will, popular engagement with the political process. And of course, in a lot of ways in the 1800s, it almost has a sense of quid pro quo. I provide you this, I provide you a free meal, I provide you some whiskey, I promise to do X, Y, Z for you, and in return, you promise to vote for me. We'll see this idea of party politics and party machines staying with us all the way through the 1800s. So part of what's going to happen is they begin to create a lot of paraphernalia. This is the emergence of things like cigar boxes and buttons and ribbons and all that kind of stuff. And you can thank Martin Van Buren for this. Martin Van Buren is nicknamed the Little Magician because he was able to magically produce voters. And he, of course, some of this is by shady methods. Some of this is just by what I just described, this idea of appealing to the common person. And of course, as I point out here, the irony is that democracy is opening up even as the market economy is developing stricter class structures. So we have less social mobility. We have stricter class status, that it's much harder to move from working class to middle class to upper class, or to move from being, a poor farmer to being a plantation owner. Like, it's very hard to do that. But even as that's becoming harder and harder and harder, and the economic system is becoming more challenging, you see democracy opening up as a way to kind of keep people happy and content with their government. Again, we saw this a little bit with Bacon and Berkeley, so this is not a new concept in the United States. A couple of pictures that kind of depict democracy in the 1800s, this idea of a carnival atmosphere, everybody showing up and hanging out, and like I said, having some beers and playing some games, and guys standing around talking. That's what the 1800s politics is all about. And so this is, we think about that as kind of being the beginning of the country, and yet really politically it wasn't all that great. Remember that, Jefferson talks a lot about the virtue of the Republican farmer. Well, we have a lot of farmers, but we don't have always a lot of virtue when they're all hanging out there, right? So that's kind of the background of kind of Jackson's kind of strange personality, his domineering personality, his tendency to use the spoil system to promote his friends, to use some politics and politics and their tricks with kind of parties and booze and that sort of thing. And you also have, just some really unique characteristics coming from this time period. So this takes us into the election of 1824. This is when we're going to talk about kind of the corrupt bargain. Again, this is still kind of in the era of good feelings, kind of, but we have a lot of regionalism taking place. So basically you have 5 candidates running for president, and they're all based on regional identities, these regional issues about internal improvements and tariffs and, slavery and so forth and so on. So the way it's going to break down, and I think I mentioned this briefly in class, Jackson has the most votes, but not the electoral votes. John Quincy Adams is the second. Henry Clay is the third. Henry Clay, who's kind of Western, but kind of sees the relationship between the West and the North, kind of works. It doesn't trust Andrew Jackson, doesn't really care for Andrew Jackson that much, thinks he's kind of a blowhard, untrustworthy, changes his mind, doesn't believe that Jackson will follow through. So he supports John Quincy Adams. And in supporting John Quincy Adams, he throws his electoral votes his way. And there's kind of this, he becomes the Secretary of State afterwards. Jackson basically makes the accusation that this was a backroom deal, that this was corrupt, that John Quincy Adams worked his corrupt magic, and Henry Clay was a part of that. And so this will split the Democrat-Republican Party into 2 different groups. This is where you have the Democrats, who embody small government, the Jeffersonian ideal, and what we call the National Republicans. National Republicans believe in the American system, the market economy, factories, tariffs, all that kind of stuff. And so, the election of 1824 will solidify that John Quincy Adams is the president, and he will be labeled as corrupt, as out of touch, as being part of this elite Northern group. And Jackson will continue to kind of solidify the Democrats into this party of, Jeffersonian farmers, if you will. So you want to know the election of 1824 because of its so-called corrupt bargain. Also, it's the last election of the era of good feelings and the one that really propels Andrew Jackson, because when he claims, when he claims that he is, the victim of this kind of deal, he's going to get a lot of traction for the 1828 election. And this is part of why he and John Quincy Adams have so much bad blood between them. Why John Quincy Adams and his campaign will pull out the whole issue of Rachel and her previous marriage and that sort of thing. So, again, John Quincy Adams, is he truly corrupt? I don't know that he's truly corrupt. He clearly has a preference for the manufacturing system and has a preference for internal improvements at the expense of the South and the West. Some people construe that as corrupt. He's the guy that he wants to spend government money to build a museum. He's a big fan of public education, things like that we kind of take for granted as being good things these days. Now, for the Jacksonians, to them, that's a waste of money. This is not a good use of taxpayer dollars. So what you're going to see is they're going to be highly critical of Adams, is trying to pork barrel the northern area to keep that support. So again, we're going to have a fractured party with the era of good feelings. So we no longer have Democrat-Republicans. We have Democrats and we have National Republicans. And this is where the difference comes in, if I can make this thing change. So election of 1828. So 24 to 28, John Quincy Adams catches a lot of bad press, all that kind of stuff. Jackson appeals to the common man. He, has kind of this rough and ready, I fought in the Revolution, Battle of New Orleans, Indian fighter. You have John Quincy Adams really going, and his campaign really going after Rachel. This infuriates Jackson. Rachel will die. She'll have a heart attack. Now, Jackson, of course, kind of romanticizes, oh, she died of a broken heart. Well, she died of a heart attack. She was never a particularly healthy woman anyways. And this happens after he's won the 1828 election, but before he's taken the oath of office. And so this is going to really be the foundation for why Jackson really dislikes Washington, D.C. He really blames politics in D.C. and, these political divisions for why his wife has died. Now, the interesting thing about the election of 1828 is Martin Van Buren basically convinces everyone that that Andrew Jackson can be all things to all people. So John C. Calhoun sells Andrew Jackson to the South as being against the factory system and pro-slavery, which he was pro-slavery. But how much was he against the factory system? Was he really against tariffs? He really didn't have an opinion, if you want the honest truth. He did not have he says he does, but in practice, he doesn't take these opinions and apply them. He writes a lot of things about it, but, makes a lot of profound statements. But those don't translate really into policy. The West basically says, to the West, he says, oh, well, I do like tariffs. So you've got this conflicting message already. Pro-tariffs, anti-tariffs. I like state banks. I want a stable economy. He's very vague, okay? And so this is part of his appeal. So his appeal is very much one of celebrity. I'm famous for the Battle of New Orleans. I'm this tough common man kind of thing. But as far as practical policy decisions, you don't see a whole lot of detail coming from him. And this is going to be kind of part of his MO. This is why it gets so frustrating dealing with Andrew Jackson, because he never really says very clearly what he's, what he's all about. His inauguration, he opens up the White House. He says, oh, well, this is the people's house, right? So he throws open the doors and lets everybody come in. And basically people tear up the place. They rip up floors. They rip up carpets. They rip up drapes. Really kind of like damages the White House. So they have to go in and repair it after his inauguration. Now, his intent was to make an appeal to the common man, make them feel a part of the White House. And so you have emerging from this 1828 election, really 1824 and 1828, but especially 1828. Instead of it being the Jeffersonian Democrats, the Jeffersonian, politicians, now they're truly Jacksonian. Jacksonians are much more concerned about liberty. They distrust strong government. In fact, they criticize any kind of government. It is trying to take our liberty away. It's the tool of special interests. Says that it's very pro-farmer, pro-agriculture, pro-artisans and skilled labor because, those big factories, they destroy skilled labor. They produce too much stuff. They drive costs down. They don't like public education because that's, government encroachment upon the rights of parents. They oppose reform issues that, that they think, things like temperance or, things like, taking care of the mentally ill. They say, oh, well, that interferes with our right of individualism. And so they're very much kind of this pro-individualism idea. And so they talk a lot about the Jeffersonian concept of this virtuous Republican farmer. So they really kind of emphasize that in their rhetoric. Now, in practice, there's a lot of obstruction going on. And you have a lot of politicians that disagree with Jackson, that don't like him, that think he's heavy-handed, that don't like his lack of policy, if you will. They think, well, gee, these ideas are great, but what are you actually going to do to govern the country? And so this obstruction is going to force Jackson into this really strong president. And I don't necessarily mean that as a good thing. This is a strong president that in many ways kind of abuses his power. But he also gives jobs to his friends. He promotes slavery and that kind of thing. So you'll see that Jackson will use the veto all the time. Every time there's a policy he doesn't like, he vetoes it. And of course, that leads us to the big question: who really runs the country? Is it the president? Is it the legislature? Who's the one that calls the shots? Jackson will focus a lot on pet issues, things like the Bank of the U.S., the Washington, D.C. politics, Native Americans, and he doesn't really care too much about the common good. And notice I referenced here the Federalist 10. The Federalist 10 document, of course, talked about watching out for these demagogues that would manipulate people's factional interests, right? Well, that's really what you see Jackson doing. Now, he claims he's representing the people, but is he? Or is he just representing a faction, and particularly his own faction? Again, he rewards his friends. He rewards people in the Democratic Party with positions in government. He has essentially an unofficial cabinet. So he has one cabinet that he has that is approved by Congress, and then he basically has another cabinet that is the one he turns to for advice. So he really kind of circumvents the norms and standards of the presidency. And he and John C. Calhoun will be his vice president, right? So one of the ways in which they make Jackson attractive in 1828 is by putting Calhoun with him to bring the southern kind of section along with him. And Calhoun and Jackson very quickly get sideways with each other, don't like each other, will fight with each other, and that's going to weaken Jackson. He's not going to be able to really work with D.C. politics, so again, this is going to tend to lead him to rely on veto power and direct presidential action and that kind of thing. And you'll see that Jackson really here's the irony, right? This is a guy that really kind of gains his wealth and his power and his prestige because of the market system, because of the economic system, because of the growth of manufacturing and cotton and all that kind of stuff. So he benefits from the market system. But when he becomes president, he basically says, well, the market system's to blame for people losing money and people having foreclosures. So I think we should get rid of this market system. We need to go back to the way Jefferson wanted it. And so he actively opposes anything having to do with the Bank of the United States, and really kind of creates some problems. Now, that's really not as ideal as one would think, because ultimately he uses that power to help his friends and help state banks. Remember, he's got a grudge on his shoulder because he blames the Bank of the U.S. for why he has lost money. So again, is it good for the American people to oppose this market economy that's already been around for almost 30 years or so? Is this something we should do? He doesn't really care. He doesn't stop to ask that question, because in Jackson's mind, if it's wrong to him, it's just flat out wrong, and he doesn't ever get puzzled about that. So I think it's kind of an interesting way to see Jackson, truthfully. Next, we'll talk about the Indian removal. He has a very paternalistic attitude towards Indians, as you'll see in the readings next week. And so he thinks that removal is best because they are inferior people. He ignores the fact that we have the Indian Intercourse Act from the 1790s, basically disregards that like it doesn't exist. He doesn't see that tribes have any kind of rights or privileges. And basically says that Indian land belongs to the United States and they don't have any say to it. So you have this Indian Removal Act, which is really kind of triggered by states like Georgia that want to expand cotton production, right? Remember, we've got the whole cotton industry, textiles, all that kind of stuff. And again, the market economy is a part of that. And so Georgia wants to encourage expansion, and they essentially want to tell the Cherokee especially, that we'll trade you land on the other side of the Mississippi River for the land you have in Georgia. And they actually try to force the Cherokee to do this. And the Cherokee say, no, we're not going to do that. And they basically file a case. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sides with the Cherokee. And Jackson says, let them try to enforce it. And so the Indian Removal Act of 1830 will continue to be the foundation for why they forcibly removed the American Indians to what is now Oklahoma. And of course, this horrible Trail of Tears, is just terrible. People starve. It's literally people are forced to move overnight. It's really quite sad. And Jackson uses, basically ignores the Supreme Court that says this is not a constitutional law, that you can't do this. And so you end up having people being forced to move. So it's pretty sad, his use of executive power there. You're also going to see that Jackson starts to put an end to what we call our internal improvements, because he says that internal improvements in the debate over tariffs, that's what the problem, that's where sectionalism comes from, is because, people in the South resent tariff money going for that. I think that's looking at the results, not the cause. And he begins to veto a lot of internal improvement projects, and basically says he wants a reduction in tariffs because he doesn't think that the government needs to be that big. But then again, he's also very critical of people like John C. Calhoun, who basically lead the charge against tariffs, that, tariffs are this evil, evil thing, and we need to do something about it. So he's going to kind of push back against that. And so again, kind of this, it's okay when he criticizes internal improvements, but not okay when other people do it. And the other piece of the problem, actually, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here and I'll finish recording it, since I'm almost at 30 minutes. So this kind of gives you the kind of an idea of the basic ideas of Jackson. Surely you're starting to get an idea that he was not particularly consistent, that he said one thing and did another, that what was okay for him to do is not okay for somebody else, and that he was not necessarily good at governing, even if he was good